The following episode can be viewed on the YouTube channel Bernie or Bust Television. Snarling Condescending Elitism versus Grubby Populism. Bernie or Bust is clearly in the latter camp. I typically don't wear a suit and tie when I narrate the Bernie or Bust show on the Bernie or Bust Television YouTube channel or the Revolution or Bust podcast, although you probably wouldn't see on the podcast if I was wearing a tie. Even though I'm an academic by trade, I don't identify with the bourgeoisie. I will always be an anti-oligarchy and pro-democracy sort of guy. I will always be a champion of grubby populism. If people need to see me in a suit and tie to take me seriously, then they are those against whom I fight. One of my most frequent topics for articles, videos, and podcasts is some form of snarling condescending elitism versus grubby populism. My observation over both of the most recent election cycles is that those who protest against the Bernie or Bust movement have clearly chosen to identify with the competent, professional, civil people, think Nancy Pelosi, possessing good references and resumes, aka wine track voters, rather than with the typical working class people who have not distinguished themselves by choosing the right college, the right friends, and the right income bracket. Among many other choices, these are just a few examples. The ordinary women and men who do the real work in society, especially for employers such as Walmart, Amazon, or McDonald's, are the ones who most need an amplified voice. Bernie or Bust is for them. That's why nobody wants to talk about Bernie or Bust this election cycle. For most elitists, it would identify them with the wrong crowd, a deplorably populist crowd. The Bernie or Bust movement is populist by its very essence. It is all about leverage. Bernie or Bust forces the upper crust and their sycophantic cronies to reconsider their choices for politicians and for policy. Bernie or Bust makes the pugilistic assertion, in the same way that labor unions and street protesters do, that party unity can be achieved only by taking into account the needs of regular people, rather than by continuing the indentured servitude served up by both U.S. political parties over at least the last 70 years. Even though most grubby populists don't realize it, this type of thinking is quintessentially leftist, which is why a social democrat such as Bernie Sanders, once the loaded scary words are stripped away, is most appealing to the grubby populists who identify themselves at all points along the political spectrum. Let's face it, historically speaking, those in power have never favored democracy. It is nigh impossible to effectively harness the resources of the masses when they have too much say in their own life situations. Political candidates in both parties have been chosen over the years by party bosses who ruthlessly ensure that anyone who gets put forward for the masses to select are in no way likely to represent the needs of said masses after they have been elected. That's how and why incrementalism was invented. That's why Bernie or Bust is so abhorrent to that echelon of leaders and their cronies who have worked so hard by hook and by crook to harness the resources of the masses. The stealthy elitists who openly support Bernie are probably even more dangerous than are those such as Neera Tanden and John Cowan, who openly resist him. Why? Because they know that their neo-lib centrist counterparts will ensure that he never gets the nomination, and that, judging by the 2016 and 2018 elections, many of his less feisty supporters will nevertheless be absorbed into the Democratic fold. It is interesting when A-list people from the Hollywood crowd endorse Bernie. You can feel the condescension rising around them from their famous, glamorous peers. How dare you endorse a grubby populist? We don't want the hoi polloi to get the idea that they can stop serving us and instead do what's best for their own lives. The criticisms endured by Susan Sarandon are a vivid case in point. Just so you know, Susan was never a Republican. Bernie Sanders is increasingly likely to win the Democratic nomination. Just as many of the Democratic elitists are beginning to realize that Bernie has a real shot at the nomination, those in the Bernie or Bust movement are beginning to pivot their attention away from Bernie's Democratic rivals and to focus directly on Bernie's contest with Donald Trump. Some of us Bernie or busters have been saying all along that defeating Trump will be far easier than defeating the rigged DNC. Bernie's current surge is not going away. He will ride this wave in the next month's primaries and caucuses and will pull away from the Democratic crowd all the way into the July Democratic Convention. See you in Milwaukee. Therefore, as some of us pivot away from Biden, Buttigieg, Warren as the primary adversaries, I feel the need to make it abundantly clear so that nobody asks me for my tax returns that I am not an elitist sheepdog. What do sheep say? Vote blue no matter who. Some of the professional sheepdogs, both politicians and pundits, who openly endorse Bernie have all along been more than willing to tribalistically absorb the energy of Bernie's new constituents into the blatantly elitist Democratic Party with no true intention of changing the party to better reflect the needs of the working class. This, by the way, is how incrementalism has always served austerity politics/economics. When push comes to shove, as it does with the Bernie or bust movement, these sheepdogs vehemently resist the idea of #DemExit as a means to unrig the party and force it to better serve the needs of the new wave of Bernie supporters who are in desperate need of hope and change. Only for real. New voters, beware the sheepdog. To separate myself from these sheepdogs, in addition to not dressing like them, I have been crying out on social media platforms for the suspected sheepdogs to reveal their tax returns in the same way that politicians are called to do. In lieu of that, I would be happy for them to prove their true progressive bona fides by A, refraining from sheepdogging, and by B, agreeing to report on the fact that Bernie or Trump voters in swing states absolutely are poised to hand the election to Trump again, thus warning their wine-track friends that #Unite Behind Bernie is the only alternative to 4 more years, assuming he will leave after that, of Donald Trump. I take their reticence in both areas to signify that if they are not taking money from the DNC machinery, as the Young Turks are, at least they can be accused of identifying and allying themselves with the competent wine-track insiders who resent being ordered around by any of Bernie's grubbiest of populist supporters. I count Bernie or bust as grubby, but Bernie or Trumpers are extremely grubby in their eyes. It is then fair to tell them that they will thus be complicit with those who would rather continue with Trump than endure the existential threat, to quote John Cowan, of a Sanders presidency. I've linked here to an article called "Bernie or Bust is Not the Main Story, Not Even in Swing States," to describe the awesome power of Bernie or Trump voters, even though there aren't very many of them, in the states of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. Personally, I am tired of liberals and neoliberals. I'm with Phil Oakes, who rightfully criticizes their hypocrisy and their woke signaling. I am tired of the lip service that is not backed up with any kind of true empathy for the plight of those lower down the socioeconomic ladder. Liberals and neoliberals are just as bad as the conservatives who blame immigrants for their economic and social problems. Their value systems are merely 2 different flavors of bigotry. Bernie or bust is the answer to incrementalism and austerity, whether cloaked or not. It is the answer to climate crisis, injustice towards minorities, school children, women, LGBTQ, and all other oppressed constituencies, and it is the answer to the professional sheepdogs who are opportunistically preying on the components of Bernie's newly energized base, who should get something in return for their loyalty to Bernie other than the bait and switch ploy of being told that it is their future duty to vote for corporatist candidates in future elections if populist candidates are outmaneuvered by party insiders who don't give an actual shit about them.
Get on board the Bernie or bust train. Come get on board the Bernie or bust train. Once you hear that clickety-clack, there ain't no time for turning back. Go get on board the Bernie or bust train.
The preceding episode can be viewed on the YouTube channel Bernie or Bust Television.